Hello. Firstly, I would like to thank the conference organizer for the chance given. My name is Enira Arvanda. I am a PhD candidate in the Faculty of Art, Design and Architecture at Monash University, Australia. The article that I'm going to present today is a part of my ongoing PhD research. The title of my presentation is They Taped All the Chairs: Breastfeeding in Public Space During COVID-19 Pandemic. The ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has a prominent effect on breastfeeding mothers' breastfeeding journey and their relationship with public space. The strict and lengthy lockdown in Melbourne, Australia, in the latter half of 2020 resulted in breastfeeding confined inside the domestic space. Even after the lockdown eased and everyday life resumed, the pandemic still affects breastfeeding women's perception and safety and breastfeeding practice outside the home. The women's concern and their strategy to breastfeed safely in public space amidst the ongoing pandemic are explored in this article. So here is the structure of my presentation today. My PhD research revolves around the experience of breastfeeding women in urban public spaces and how the built environment plays an important role as the setting. It seeks to find the environmental factors and characteristics of urban setting that encourage women to breastfeed in public. The study's main objective is to propose an inclusive urban design guideline for a breastfeeding-friendly city, which focus on Melbourne as the context. My study does not focus on the relationship between breastfeeding spaces and COVID-19. However, during the first phase of the research in early 2021, the city of Melbourne had experienced several phases of strict and prolonged lockdown. Thus, when I conducted an online survey about breastfeeding women's experience in public space from April to May 2020, the pandemic impact was reflected in the participants' answers and further explored for this article. The paper argues that the current situation could be counterproductive to normalizing breastfeeding in public, which would result in the activity continuously being marginalized in public spaces. The paper demonstrates the value of public space from the perspective of breastfeeding women and how the urban environment has a significant role in encouraging women to breastfeed publicly during and post-COVID-19 pandemic. Melbourne is an Australian city that experienced the longest lockdown period in the world during the COVID-19 pandemic. From March 2020 until this paper was written in October 2021, Melburnians have spent 260 days under strict lockdown. In addition, the state government implemented various restrictions that limit citizens' mobility except for essential needs. In this situation, one of the groups affected by the prolonged lockdown is new parents. Breastfeeding mothers were part of this. Studies on breastfeeding women's experience during the pandemic show how new mothers struggled with sustaining breastfeeding due to a lack of social and emotional support during their early postpartum days. The postpartum or postnatal period is incredibly challenging because the body system works hard to recover to its pre-pregnancy state. A woman also experiences a lot of emotional and psychological changes due to their new role as a mother. Therefore, there are growing concerns over new mothers' mental well-being during the extended COVID-19 pandemic. In a recent Australian and New Zealand study on the well-being of breastfeeding women, women's most cited worries were related to COVID-19 health and safety. Participants noted worries about being unable to see family members due to lockdowns and border closures. their family safety and well-being, and their infant or children growing up without everyday social interactions. The pandemic situation significantly reduced social interactions and the possibility of getting peer support. Informal gatherings with peers through everyday social events, like, for example, playdates, could help relieve maternal stress and exchange knowledge on breastfeeding and parenting practices. New mothers are yet to adapt to the changes to online or non face to face lifestyles. Due to the nature of COVID-19 virus, which spreads through respiratory droplets and contact with contaminated surfaces, the policies and guidelines taken by the government to reduce the spread of the virus are through social distancing and limiting mobility. As the virus is reportedly more likely to spread faster in crowded and poorly ventilated indoor places, closures of many public facilities, mainly indoor places such as sports centers, libraries, or recreational places, were inevitable. This certainly has an impact on human interaction with public spaces. Breastfeeding mothers feel isolated inside their houses. Thus, being outside becomes a way to overcome boredom and to reduce stress during the lockdown, even for a limited time. However, not all households have direct access to outdoor spaces, especially for people who live in high-rise apartments. Therefore, urban outdoor spaces become a necessity that offers a much-needed indoor-outdoor balance. The outdoor environment offered solace during the COVID-19 pandemic, as it is considered a safer choice for exercise and other activities, and even safe for young children. The natural qualities of the outdoor environment offer many health benefits and help to reduce anxiety and stress. Research on maternal health suggests that pregnant or postpartum women who are able to engage in regular physical activity may have improved mental health compared to those who are not. Outdoor public spaces like parks or promenades offered a retreat for citizens during the pandemic. However, even though public parks were accessible, the playgrounds were closed and public sittings were unavailable as a safety measure and to prevent people from loitering. Moreover, people were highly monitored by the authorities so as not to violate the lockdown restrictions. The unprecedented situation challenges breastfeeding women and adds complexities to their overall relationship and experience with public spaces. Breastfeeding in public has always been challenging for women, even before the pandemic happened. The complexities of breastfeeding in public originated from the oversexualization of women's breasts. The sight of it in public, for whatever reason, is vulgar. In addition, breast milk itself is associated with shame and disgust, like any other bodily fluids that result from sexual organs and reproduction. Thus, it should be contained and concealed from the public eyes. Under this strong cultural perception about breastfeeding in public, women who transgress the cultural boundaries are at risk of a social stigma. The social expectation of breastfeeding being performed in the private sphere creates a dilemma for women. It triggers the perception that breastfeeding is not appropriate in public and that there are improper or socially unacceptable spaces and places for breastfeeding. The genderization of public space and the dichotomy between public and private space positions breastfeeding space as liminal. As a result, women continuously negotiate in and out of space to avoid embarrassment and to maintain public comfort. To claim their legal rights to breastfeed in public spaces, women often manage their bodies and apply various tactics when performing breastfeeding, including carefully positioning themselves in public spaces. And by creating a private bubble, the negotiations are made to avoid unwanted events and to minimize the risk of harassment. Among many strategies that women do to avoid embarrassment is being careful when choosing a location for breastfeeding. The process of choosing a location is based on a variety of subjective considerations. Women need a conducive situation that allows them to relax and focus on their baby to breastfeed successfully. In other words, a certain spatial setting is needed to support breastfeeding women. When breastfeeding is performed outside the domestic setting, the urban environment and its configuration become the determining factors that may support or constrain breastfeeding. On that account, the planning and design of public spaces contribute to a supportive environment for breastfeeding women and to improve public health. The study is based on an online survey that is part of the author's doctoral research. The survey's criteria are breastfeeding women living in Melbourne who are currently breastfeeding or have had breastfeeding experience in the past 24 months. The survey was distributed through various social media and the researcher's personal network. It was approved by the Australian Breastfeeding Association and distributed to its local members within the metropolitan Melbourne area. There are 35 questions about breastfeeding experience and spatial preferences when breastfeeding in a public space. This article reflects on participants' answers for one segment in the survey, which asks for place preferences when breastfeeding in public spaces and the reasons behind it. All the questions in this section were designed as an open-ended type to elaborate the answers. The result is then coded in NVivo and analyzed using qualitative thematic analysis to find themes that emerge from the responses related to the spatial characteristics of breastfeeding-friendly spaces. This article will focus on findings related to breastfeeding women's experience in public space during COVID-19. Based on the survey, 40% of participants spent more than twice a week breastfeeding in public spaces. Considering that 75% of the participants spent their whole breastfeeding journey during the pandemic, it indicates that breastfeeding women and their babies still frequently use urban public spaces despite the pandemic. However, the reasons for their outings vary greatly, including shopping, leisurely walks, care-related journey, recreation, exercising, socializing, and work-related purposes. The continuing activity in public spaces may be due to the women having received sufficient information about breastfeeding safety during the pandemic and how to stay safe in public spaces. In addition, health institutions such as WHO and breastfeeding associations were actively campaigning that breastfeeding is safe to be performed. When the participants were asked about their preferred location for breastfeeding, the most selected places included public parks, playgrounds, parents' rooms, and cafes. Interestingly, many stated that they could breastfeed anywhere, as long as there was a comfortable seat. From their elaborated answers, it is clear that breastfeeding location is carefully chosen by considering physical and psychological aspects. Among the criteria for choosing a location are quiet places, not crowded, comfortable, safe, hygienic, and can provide a sense of privacy. For most participants in the study, the availability of sittings is a major deciding factor for choosing a breastfeeding location. The women need the sitting object to hold their posture right and to support their back while breastfeeding. However, physical comfort is arguably negotiable for these women. What more matters to them is where the sitting is located. The perceived social stigma also shaped the women's decision. For example, some participants tend to avoid attracting attention due to fear of being judged and receiving unwanted reactions. Hence, the presence of strangers in the surroundings, especially the opposite sex, is one of the determining factors in place selection. In the pandemic context, mothers also face social stigma regarding their decision to breastfeed outside the home. There were several incidents in the Australian media where mothers were being criticized for the lack of judgment and risking their baby's health. Participants' answers give insight that they did not have many options for breastfeeding locations during the pandemic. With many non-essential facilities being closed, open spaces such as public parks were the only available options. Dedicated breastfeeding spaces such as the parents' room was largely unavailable during the lockdown. The facility is not considered safe because it is indoor, confined, and air circulation is not guaranteed. Perception of risk became the basis for participants' decision when assessing whether a location is feasible or not. One participant expressed her frustration because public sittings were becoming increasingly difficult to find since the pandemic happened. The public sittings were often occupied by smokers who hung out during their cigarette breaks and made the air around them become unhealthy. She expressed how unsafe she felt to breastfeed nearby the smokers. Thus, she rather breastfeed while kept on walking. The sling became a tool that helped her to keep going with breastfeeding. Another participant described the difficulty of finding a seat because all the sittings in the shopping center had duct tape all over it. The urgency to breastfeed did not give her time to look for another location. She felt embarrassed because she decided to sit on the duck-covered seating. At that time, she risked being judged by the people around her and for violating the rules. As mentioned previously, breastfeeding women tend to avoid embarrassment and discomforting others. Thus, breastfeeding is carefully managed to fit into breastfeeding etiquette in public spaces. However, mothers would negotiate their feelings to fulfill the baby needs immediately and risk judgment from others. The paper demonstrates how the COVID-19 pandemic in Melbourne, Australia poses new challenges for breastfeeding women's relation with public spaces due to the new risk factors. Women had to calculate risk and face social judgment for their decision. Thus, some would understandably reduce the frequency of leaving home. However, even for those who took the risk, some spaces and places are considered safe or unsafe for breastfeeding. For example, indoor places with poor ventilation or places where it is difficult to practice social distancing would deem unsafe. On the contrary, outdoor places with good air circulation and ample spaces for social distancing would be considered safe. However, with the rising popularity of outdoor spaces, it also created a new challenge for breastfeeding women. It was increasingly harder for breastfeeding women to find a place and get a sense of safety and privacy. More attention is needed for indoor facilities that mothers and babies often frequent. Specialized breastfeeding rooms should be well ventilated and cleaned regularly to improve safety. Sittings availability is one of the deciding factors for choosing a breastfeeding location. Thus, public sittings inside shopping centers and other public facilities could be added and rearranged to ensure social distancing. Additional sittings could be placed in less crowded areas so women could maintain their social distance and private bubble without being separated from the publicness. Sense of privacy could be attained through spatial arrangements. When the paper was written, the state premier of Victoria finally ended lockdown as its double vaccination rate has reached its 70% milestone. The sixth lockdown lasted for 82 days, and the state is currently gearing toward the new normal. It is expected that breastfeeding mothers and babies will make more journeys in the urban public space. To ensure their needs and safety are met, policymakers, urban planners, and designers need to understand better how breastfeeding is practiced in the urban setting by looking at the issue from the women's perspective. It will sharpen our understanding of how to address the challenge and reshape how to relate to public space. Thank you for your attention.